Hello, I'm Dickie Arbiter in London.
And I'm Victoria Arbiter in New York, and you're watching Royal Report. I think I speak for both of us when I say we have been hugely encouraged by the words of enthusiasm and the positive response to Royal Report. The overriding theme has been one of viewers being excited to have a platform where there is positive royal fare, but it hasn't gone over quite so well with everyone. And last week we garnered quite a vociferous response from Republicans and anti-monarchists. And I always think that insults are typically the last form of defense for people with a crumbling position. I'm not here to mock their response. Definitely, we are very fortunate to live in a free democratic society where we are able to express our views. And I think both Dad and I really do embrace those views and welcome the argument. But I think it was quite interesting to note that all of this happened right around the time Republic, just a couple of weeks ago, sent in a team of protesters to Buckingham Palace who promptly undid their jackets and revealed T-shirts spelling out, well, supposed to spell out "not my king." But I don't think it was quite the win they were anticipating. First of all, those protesters had to pay the entrance fee into Buckingham Palace. I'm sure the Royal Collection Trust, which is a charity charged with funding the Royal Collection, were quite happy about that. But the spacing of the protesters as well meant that they were widely ridiculed on social media. It read more like "no to my king." Again, I'm not here to mock, but I think the point is that they were able to go into Buckingham Palace and express their views about King Charles not being their king. Similarly, on the first anniversary of the Queen's death, there was a lone protester photographed outside Buckingham Palace, and a post was subsequently put on Twitter in which they were holding up a big banner saying "no more royals." It was one person. I don't know if anyone else showed up. I wasn't there, but that post only garnered around 81 likes. So again, I think that fell a little flat, but that's not to say there isn't a large anti-monarchist agenda from some people in the UK. So my question to you, Dad, given that, is that the King in the past has openly supported people's right to protest. He obviously believes in a free democratic society. But how do you think situations like that will have been viewed behind palace walls? And how do you think the King will be responding? Because, of course, it's so early in his reign. Do you think he'll have been put off by that? Do you think he'll have thought it was a bit of a giggle? What are your thoughts, knowing him as you did, having worked with him for so long?
Well, the King is a true Democrat. There's no question about that. His mother was a Democrat as well, as we heard from her speech in Australia following its referendum saying that the Australians must decide their future. But the King is a Democrat. The number of times he's had eggs thrown at him, tomatoes thrown at him, and he's just carried on. Occasionally, the odd one has hit his suit, but he has just carried on. He just brushes it off. He's not going to let anything interfere with his job. As far as the protesters at Buckingham Palace are concerned, yeah, they went in, they made a bit of a Horlicks of their message. But how do you stop people like that? Because if somebody's clothed, they've got a coat on or a jacket on or a shirt and a T-shirt underneath, short of stripping them, you don't know what they're going to do. So it is open to anybody and everybody who wants to visit the staterooms. They pay their £12 or $15, whatever case may be, and they go around and they reach a point. They're all together and they open their jackets, they open their shirts and display their T-shirts. Short of stripping them, you can't stop that sort of thing. But the Buckingham Palace officials would have been a bit annoyed that something like that happened, but you can't do anything about it. The Royal Collection would have been upset because they're the ones managing the Buckingham Palace opening, that something like that got past them. Again, nothing they can do about it. The King would have said, well, it's everybody's right to protest. Pity they did it at Buckingham Palace, but it did get a lot of negative press because they didn't get the message right. So it's just kind of brushed off. It's the first time that in my known history, that Republic have actually had to pay to protest. In the past, they've always manage to voice an opinion that's been picked up by the media and they get free publicity. This time they had to pay something like over £300 to get into Buckingham Palace for their trouble. And the message was a bit Horlicks, that they didn't get the message across at all. And everybody had a bit of a laugh at their expense and moved on. But, protest is something that happens in the UK. It is a democratic right of people to protest, that they go into Buckingham Palace to do it. Well, it's something that's happened. It might happen again. Who knows? You can't, short of stripping somebody, you cannot stop that sort of thing.
I do think it's important to point out, however, this was not a violent protest. It was, a few people just pulling their jackets over and there with their t-shirts spelling out the message. And so I think it is important to note that, because violent protests, of course, that is something entirely different. And I think Republic has been keen to promote its message in a peaceful fashion, albeit quite loud, whether it's across the street from a bunch of school children shouting for the king, whatever it is. But I think we do have to point that out while we're talking about it. But like with any other soap opera, when it comes to members of the royal family, there are heroes and villains. And I think throughout the king's tenure as Prince of Wales, of course, the longest serving heir apparent in history, the longest serving Prince of Wales in British history, he has routinely been pegged as the villain. So everybody loved Diana, everybody loved William and Harry, everybody loved the Queen, and he was the one that was constantly being vilified in the press. Now that must have been quite difficult when you were working for him, because at the end of the day, he is a human being and your feelings get hurt. You can only brush it off so much before you're thinking, I am doing all of this work. I'm trying so hard to better the lives of people, charities, organizations, the environment, and I'm constantly being vilified. So how did you get around handling that? I'm not suggesting that he had a fragile ego or a victim type persona. I mean, that's not who he is. But at some point, you must have been sort of trying to rally and buck up his sense of self-esteem, or make him see that he wasn't really the butt of every joke.
It's quite interesting you raise that, because when on tour or going around the country, everywhere he went, people turned out, people cheered him, people wanted to talk to him, people wanted to glad hand him. Even with the Prince's Trust going to Caistor Camp just outside Great Yarmouth, the youngsters wanted to speak to him. They wanted him to acknowledge them and them to acknowledge him. And they did that. It's the press had a bit of a fest in terms of the negativity. Yes, there were people who were against him because of what happened to Diana, but let's clear up this myth. Diana was no angel. She was terrific. I loved her. I think you loved her as well. She attracted that sort of love, but she was no angel. She had her bad ways. She had her good ways, and yes, she was an attractive woman and everybody felt sorry for her. People always feel sorry for the wronged woman. But, Charles was the wrong man, because she wasn't always kosher either. She did have her relationships. Look, at the end of the day, marriages are not made in heaven. People have got to work at a marriage. Once all the, dare I say, the lust and the passion has worn off, it's a job and you've got to work at that job. There were two people, unfortunately, embroiled in the royal circus, and I'm going to use that word loosely. They had a job to do. They had a job to do representing the Queen. They had a job to do representing the country. Their time was not their own. So they did eventually find different directions to go. This is not to say that they didn't do their job superbly. They both did their job superbly. They just found it difficult working together. And when they had to work together, they put on a very good show. But after a while, even that is chipped away and they can no longer pretend. So they weren't both angels. They were both very good parents, but they just couldn't work together. In fact, their relationship was a lot closer when they separated at the end of 1992 than at any time in the previous 5 years. So that says something about the two people who, as a married couple, couldn't actually get on, but as a separated couple, they could.
And yet the king was such an easy target, because I know you'll remember it was always Diana, if she was in the egg and spoon race or the race at school sports day, she would make the front pages of the paper. But we never saw the photographs of the king doing his bit at school sports day. And again, in Canada, Charles and Diana had been there on tour, and they were set to be reunited with the boys on board Britannia. And there's that famous footage of Diana. She's practically running up the gangplank, and she runs along the side of the boat, and she embraces the boys in a big bear hug. But it's always cut right before you get to the big bear hug that the king gave the boys as well. But what I have been glad to see is since his accession, it's almost like he's becoming the grandfather of the nation. And I think people are finally seeing his humanity and his sense of humor. And we really saw it play out in a video that was recently released on YouTube. This is just delightful footage. I think it was 3 or 4 professional mountain bikers were cycling through the Balmoral estate. It was a typically grey and drizzly Scottish day, and they came across the king, who was just walking by himself across the Highlands, and he stopped to chat. And it just so happened that they had one of their cameras on, presumably filming their route. And so they captured this conversation, and it was so charming. The king was talking about the horrendous midges, of course, was talking about the weather, because that's what we do in the UK. But he also referred to the bothy, which is a little hut, I guess you would describe it, where people can stop and rest. And he said how he used to spend time there with his father and his sister, Princess Anne. The cyclists were on their way to have a rest. He talked about how it had been refurbished. He wanted to plant more trees. But you saw just a really warm, interested, genuine conversation.
Anyway, well, lovely to meet you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Take care, don't fall off.
No, take care.
Listen for the helicopter.
I think what people found particularly extraordinary about the cyclist interactions with the king was that they were able to get so close to him and just stand there in the drizzle, in the rain, and just chat to him as if they had bumped into one of their friends' dads. It was just such an organic, authentic, easy communication. There weren't police stepping in, trying to block off the king or any of that. And, I live in the US, and to have an interaction like that with the president would be virtually impossible. Certainly over the summer, he was photographed on the beach in Delaware with his wife, and there were members of the public that were on the beach as well, but they were at a safe distance. He was out on a bike ride on one day, but even that comes with a whole circus of the press pack, the Secret Service on their bikes. I think one member of the public was photographed giving President Biden a fist bump, but you can make no mistake that bike ride kept going. Nobody was stopping, and security was so tight. It has to be. He's the president of the United States. But people will often say to me that they find it so incredible that the royals are just kind of out there in open top carriages, or how the Queen used to ride her horse during Trooping the Colour down the Mall to Horse Guards Parade. Even the Pope will be in a Pope-mobile with bulletproof glass. That was deemed necessary after the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. So I think the security element is fascinating, but that's why I think people really warmed to this interaction between the king and the cyclists. Likewise, the Queen, when she was out with just one royal protection officer. I think people, particularly in the United States, find that quite hard to grasp. And Dad, you've sort of been there. You've seen the security forces at work. And I think the goal has always been for the royals to be accessible and the security to be sort of almost invisible, but very much there.
It's quite interesting that you raised that subject, because quite a few years ago, there was a call particularly from the Home Office, who actually run the police force in the United Kingdom, to have tighter security around the Queen. And while she acknowledged that there had to be security, she famously said, "I have to be seen to be believed." Now, you have in the United States, you have this ring of steel around the president, and you're lucky if you catch a glimpse of him. Whereas with the Queen, late Queen on walkabout, and the King more recently in Germany and in France, you saw him in all his glory. And I never forget what happened sort of barely 24 hours after he acceded to the throne. He came back to London, car stopped short of Buckingham Palace. He went on a walkabout. Somebody in the crowd pulled him forward. They gave him a kiss on the cheek. His security was there. They didn't interfere, but they were very alert as to what was actually happening. And that is the difference between the British security, which is very tight and unobtrusive, and security in the United States. And I remember very well, I think it was 1982, when late President Reagan came on an official visit, not a state visit, to Windsor Castle. And I was reporting at the time, and I was in a stand overlooking and waiting the arrival. And an American commentator said to me, "Where's all the security?" And I said, "You see that man over there? That's it." They said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, that's it." And the following day, the Queen and the President went out for a ride. The Queen was riding Burmese, and the President was riding Centennial, both horses given by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to the Queen. And they stopped just out beyond the George IV gate. And at the top of the Long Walk, there were a whole raft of reporters, mainly American, and they were shouting questions. And President Reagan inched his horse forward as if to answer some of the questions. And the Queen looked at him and thought, "I'm not having any of this." And she started to ride off. And in deference to his host, he turned his horse and rode after her. So the press pack didn't get their questions. All they got were photographs of two heads of state riding together. But yeah, the security is there. Security a few weeks ago in France, it was there. But the King and the Queen were able to engage with the public, because that is what it's all about. I refer here to a visit to Hungary. It was 91 or 92. And when we went on the recce, and there was going to be a walkabout in a square alongside the Danube, and we asked for barriers. And the Hungarians had just come out of this sort of subservient rule by the Soviet Union. And they said, no, barriers are for keeping people in. We don't imprison people. We don't keep people in. And the president at the time was acting president, Arpad Gons, and he was totally overwhelmed by this visit. And what happened was that before going to this square, the Charles and Diana were in a market, fabulous market, doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, and we actually lost them. They got swamped by people. There was Hungarian security, our security there, but they got swamped by people. Fortunately, we found them. But by the time we got to the square, those barriers were there, and there were 10 deep of people behind those barriers. They got to talk to Charles and Diana. They got to shake hands, the odd peck on the cheek, but they weren't being imprisoned. They were just being kind of controlled, so they weren't swamped like they were in the market. So yeah, security is there. Security is taken very seriously, but there's not a ring of steel as there was, for example, when Diana went to New York in 1989, when the traveling in the motorcade was controlled by the NYPD. What happened? We stopped at every traffic light when it turned red. Meanwhile, there were SWAT teams on the roof. There were people with guns all over the place. So, State Department were there with their vans with tens of armed officers. But yeah, we stopped at traffic lights. They don't quite do that over here. We go through red lights because there's a special escort group of Metropolitan Police. But security is different in every country. We don't relax here, but we do take it very seriously.
You'll remember this too, Dad. Shortly after the Queen died, Richard Griffin, I think he was a former Royal Protection Officer, and he was talking about a similar situation with the Queen. He regularly would go walking with her in the Highlands, and they would often bump into tourists. And there was one occasion they bumped into two Americans, and they didn't recognize the Queen. But they asked if she lived in the area, and she said yes, of course, playing along with all of this. And they asked if she'd ever met the Queen, and she said no, but he has, pointing to her Royal Protection Officer. And then they asked her to take a photograph of them with the Royal Protection Officer because they couldn't believe that he knew the Queen. And of course, she was tickled pink by that whole thing. Little did they know that their photograph was taken by the Queen. So I think these are the sorts of charming interactions that we so rarely get to see as members of the public. And I know that you had a similar experience with the Queen when you were out and about with her.
Yeah, I was up at Balmoral, and on a couple of occasions, actually, we were walking alongside Loch Mick, and she was explaining about a house that had been built by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert that they used to not live in, but used to go in occasionally if they were walking. And there were ramblers coming in the opposite direction, a middle-aged couple, and he bowed, she curtsied, and they just had a chatty conversation. It was nothing unique. Balmoral Estate is vast, and it is open to cyclists and it is open to ramblers. It's just very, very rarely will you bump into a member of the royal family. Those cyclists were lucky. The ramblers, when I was alongside the Queen, were lucky as well. It happened one other occasion, and a similar sort of reaction. But she put people at ease. They had a conversation, a bit like, we're talking now, just a general conversation. And that's how the Queen reacted. She was, at the end of the day, a common woman at heart. She loved the countryside. She loved dogs. She loved horses. She loved people, not necessarily in that order. But at the same time, she always said that if she had not been Queen, if she had been married to Prince Philip and lived in the country, she would have liked lots of dogs and lots of horses and been a country woman. Well, she was a country woman, but she was also Queen.
I think Balmoral really lent itself to that as well, because I think Balmoral, perhaps more than any other royal residence, was the one place on earth where they could totally switch off. There were no cameras. They weren't being followed everywhere they went. The ceremonial lifestyle could just be parked at the door and they could go in and fully relax. And I think what people enjoyed about that interaction with the king was seeing how genuinely interested he was in other people, but also how knowledgeable he was about the estate. And I know you've said in the past that the Queen was the same, particularly with the royal collection. She could walk the halls of Buckingham Palace and point to an urn or a painting or a sketch or a carriage clock, and she'd be able to tell you where it was from and the date and everything about it. And people, I think, too, they underestimate the royals in that regard as well. There's such a two-dimensional sort of figure that shows up to engagements and plants a tree or cuts a ribbon and meets the people they're supposed to. But underneath that exterior are people that genuinely enjoy, I think, those common man interactions where everyone just gets to be a regular person and the formalities are sort of left aside. And so I thought that was it was just very special. I'm glad they shared that footage of the king, and I'm sure those cyclists will remember it forever.
There's a sort of feeling, I suppose, that you wound up the Queen, or you wind up the king and point them in the right direction, and they go clattering along and they come out with words. I remember on one occasion walking through the picture gallery with the late Queen, and we stopped and she asked the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, "Where's the Vermeer gone?" She knew everything. Where was it? It should be here. And she stopped in the place where it should have been, and was told that it was as an exhibition. Well, I hope it comes back soon. So they're not just sort of clockwork people; they're real people. They know what's going on in the country. They know what's going on in the world. They know what's going on with people, the hardships that they have to suffer, and they're just interested in people. And they want to talk to people. And the king is no exception. He's always been a people person. He's always wanted to talk to people. He's always wanted to hear what people have to say. And we've seen that on his walkabouts in the UK, his walkabouts in Germany, and he was speaking German to the people, treated like pop stars, his walkabouts in France, in Paris. "Vive le roi," the crowd were shouting. Now that's quite something coming from the French, having got rid of their own monarchy 300 years ago.
I think it really speaks to the key difference, in a sense, that we're seeing between the Queen's reign and the King's, because she enjoyed a walkabout as well, but there was a slightly more deferential restraint when it came to the Queen. People weren't leaning over the barrier, planting a kiss on her cheek. They were handing flowers. And I remember you saying in the past as well that captains of industry and leaders of huge corporations would just be struck dumb when they came into contact with her. She sort of had that effect on people. What we're seeing with the King is he is really warmly receiving those hugs and kisses over the barriers. There's less reticence from him to get up close and a bit more personal, shall we say. And I think that's why he's really appealing to people. And so, yes, Republic has every right to go out and protest. Aren't we fortunate that we live in a society where that is applauded and recognized and acknowledged, and it's allowed to go ahead? But I think too, like, when we start seeing they're talking about staging so many more protests coming up, that the movement is growing, that they've got more members now than they've ever had before, that may be entirely possible, but I still think we're a long way off the wider British public supporting the movement. And I think really the protests that happened inside Buckingham Palace, yeah, it was a stunt, it was clever, they got some press and publicity out of it, but it was interesting to note how much it was mocked because of the spelling or because they'd had to pay to get in. And I think that really, they hadn't anticipated that perhaps.
What is quite interesting, you sort of raise the issue of opinion polls and what have you. Recent opinion poll showed that the king enjoyed the popularity of 62%, 77%. It liked the idea of a monarchy. Yes, the younger generation are a bit perplexed by it, and they. Quite a high number, I think it was about 38%, weren't in favour of the monarchy, more in favour of a republic. It's a generational thing, because if you go to the over 65s, the numbers are very high who are in favour of monarchy. And I think when the youngsters get slightly older and they understand what the monarchy is all about and what it does for the UK and how it helps the UK in selling itself abroad, because that's the only way that the UK survives, with investment coming into the country, that people would understand that, yeah, the monarchy is a pretty good thing. What's the alternative? The alternative is a president, is a ceremonial head of state. And if you go out in the street today, anywhere in the world, except Germany, and say, who is the president of Germany? Nobody will be able to tell you. But you ask them, who is the king of England, or though he's the king of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, who is the king? And they'll tell you that Charles. Who was the queen? Queen Elizabeth II. But they can't tell you who the presidents of the various countries are. And that's why a monarchy is so important, because it highlights the United Kingdom. Because you think monarchy, you think not United Kingdom. And you have to ask yourself, we have a monarchy here, but why do monarchies on the continental Europe survive? Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Spain, Liechtenstein. How do they survive? Oh, not forgetting Monaco as well. How do they survive? They survive because that's what the people want. And as long as the people want it, as Prince Philip once said in Canada, I think it was 1979, it survives as long as the people want it. If they don't want it, then they must do something about it.
Members of the royal family, at the end of the day, are human beings. They are going to make mistakes, and we will discuss those mistakes on Royal Report. But we are delighted to provide you with a platform where you will see a positive approach to royal news. We're not going to entertain speculation and hearsay. We're not here to perpetuate the gossip. What we do want to do is myth bust and put that gossip or speculation into context and talk about why it exists, what it stems from, and why you should, in most instances, ignore it. So please keep those questions coming. We're delighted when we see all of your notes in the comments section below. Make sure to subscribe. That way you will never miss another episode of Royal Report. Like and ring the bell, and we'll see you next time on Royal Report.